Before we begin, a mandatory disclaimer for our audience. The following story is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters and dialogues are fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever wondered what the absolute limit of a ship's will to survive looks like when the sky itself turns into a rain of fire? Most legends are born from a single lucky strike or a grand strategic victory, but the story of the USS Laffey is a brutal testament to raw, unyielding human grit. To the Japanese pilots in the spring of 1945, she was supposed to be a sacrificial lamb, a lone destroyer stationed on the dangerous edges of the fleet. But to those of us who stood on her vibrating decks, she became something else entirely. A defiant island of steel that simply refused to sink. The fascination with the Laffey isn't just about her guns, but about the psychological weight of standing your ground when 22 enemies are screaming toward you at once. My name is a shadow now, but I remember the morning of April 16th, when the horizon of Okinawa became a jagged line of smoke and desperate high-speed suicide. The fascination with our ship began long before that morning, as the USS Laffey was a Sumner-class destroyer built to replace a predecessor lost in the bloody waters of Guadalcanal. We carried the name of a fallen hero, and that psychological weight felt like a constant shadow over our daily routines as we patrolled the vast Pacific. The secret flaw of our position was our role as a radar picket ship, which meant we were the first thing the enemy saw and the first target they chose. We were the tripwire of the fleet, stationed miles away from the heavy protection of the battleships, essentially acting as bait for the incoming swarms of divine wind. The fascination of the crew was our collective focus, a sharpened sense of duty that kept us drilling at our 20mm and 40mm mounts until our hands were raw. We knew the Kamikazes were coming, a psychological terror that turned the beautiful tropical sunrise into a source of deep, underlying anxiety for every man on board. We were a small ship in a very large ocean, but we were about to become the center of a storm that would defy every rule of naval survival. The psychological weight of the kamikaze threat was unlike anything else we had faced in the long years of the war across the shifting and dangerous Pacific. It wasn't just about fighting a machine, it was about fighting a human being who had already made peace with his own violent and certain death. The fascination of the divine wind was a dark and terrifying mystery to us, a fanatical devotion that turned airplanes into guided missiles with a soul. We watched the radar screens with a silent intensity, seeing the blips multiply until the sky above Okinawa was cluttered with the ghosts of a dying empire. The secret flaw of being alone on Picket Station 1 was that there was no one to hide behind, no massive hull to soak up the incoming fire. We were the lone target, a gray speck on the water that was about to be challenged by the most concentrated aerial assault in human history. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the metallic tang of gunpowder as we waited for the first silhouette to break through the clouds. I remember the first sighting, a speck on the horizon that grew with a terrifying speed into the shape of an Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber. The fascination of the moment was the silence before the roar, that split second where the world seems to hold its breath before the metal starts screaming. The psychological weight hit us as the Val didn't pull out of its dive, but instead aimed its nose directly at our bridge with a suicidal and focused intent. Our gunners opened fire, the 5-inch mounts thundering in a rhythmic cadence that shook the very marrow of our bones and the rivets of the ship. We watched the plane disintegrate in midair, a ball of fire and debris that splashed harmlessly into the sea. But there was no time for any cheers. Behind that first plane were dozens more, a swarm of Zeros, Judys, and Oscars all converging on our position like hornets to a disturbed and angry nest. The secret flaw of our defense was our limited ammunition, a realization that forced us to make every single bullet and every single shell count for our lives. The fascination of the battle was the speed at which the chaos escalated, turning our orderly decks into a landscape of fire, blood, and the smell of burning gasoline. Within the first 20 minutes, we were being attacked from every point of the compass at once, a 360-degree nightmare that stretched our gun crews to their breaking point. The psychological weight of the noise was deafening, a constant wall of sound from the anti-aircraft fire, the screaming engines, and the dull thuds of near misses. We saw the second kamikaze strike the aft 5-inch mount, a massive explosion that killed everyone in the vicinity and sent a plume of black smoke into the air. The secret flaw of our ship was now exposed, as the fire began to spread toward the magazines, threatening to blow us apart from the inside out. But the gunners in the remaining mounts didn't flinch. They just turned their barrels toward the next incoming threat with a cold and mechanical determination. We were no longer just a ship. We were a collective will to survive, a living entity of steel and grit, fighting for every precious second. As the third and fourth planes struck, the fascination of our survival became a question of physics and the incredible strength of American naval construction and engineering. The psychological weight of the casualties was rising, but the survivors stepped over the fallen to take their places at the guns without a moment of hesitation. We were hit in the stern. The rudder jammed at a 26-degree angle, forcing the Laffey into a wide, helpless circle in the middle of a killing zone. The secret flaw of a jammed rudder in a sea full of suicide pilots should have been our death sentence, making us a predictable and easy target. Yet this circle became our defense, as our gunners used the rotation to bring different batteries to bear on the swarms of planes that continued to dive. We were a spinning fortress of fire, a gray ghost that refused to stop fighting even as our superstructure was torn to ribbons by shrapnel. The fascination of the enemy must have been intense, as they saw a small destroyer take hit after hit and still continue to spit lead into the sky. The psychological weight of the fire was the most terrifying part, as the gasoline from the crashed planes turned the aft of the ship into a literal inferno. I saw men standing in knee-deep water and oil, still passing ammunition to guns that were so hot the paint was blistering and peeling off the barrels. The fascination of the Laffey was that she didn't just take the hits. She gave them back with a fury that seemed to stun the Japanese pilots. We were a mangled wreck, our mast leaning and our radar gone, but the 20mm Oerlikons were still barking at anything that moved in the air. The secret flaw of the enemy's tactic was their singular focus on us, which allowed our gunners to predict their flight paths and fill the air with steel. We were being hammered like an anvil, but the more they hit us, the harder we became, a psychological transformation that occurs when there is nothing left to lose. Every man on that ship was a hero that day, not because they weren't afraid, but because they ignored the fear to do the impossible. I remember the sight of a Zero clipping our radar mast and crashing into the sea, the wingtip nearly taking off the head of a lookout who didn't even blink. The fascination of the battle was this strange, hyper-focused calm that settled over the crew even as the ship was literally being dismantled around our very ears. The psychological weight of the smoke was suffocating, making it hard to see the targets until they were right on top of us, forcing point-blank and desperate engagements. The secret flaw of our situation was the sheer number of planes. For every one we shot down, 2 more seemed to emerge from the gray haze of the horizon. We were hit by a bomb that penetrated the deck and exploded in the after-engine room, killing the brave men who were trying to keep our power alive. Yet the lights flickered and stayed on, a mechanical miracle that matched the human miracle happening on the blood-stained and fire-blackened decks above us. We were the ship that would not die, and the legend was being written in the fire and the salt of that terrible and glorious April morning. The fascination of the final minutes of the attack was the arrival of American Hellcats from the carriers, who dived into the fray to help us clear the sky. The psychological weight of seeing those friendly wings was like a jolt of pure adrenaline, but the battle was far from over as the Kamikazes ignored them. 1-0 pursued a Hellcat so closely that both planes flew through our own anti-aircraft fire, a chaotic dance of death just feet above our smoking and battered bridge. The secret flaw of the enemy's desperation was now evident. They were throwing everything they had at a single destroyer that refused to give them the satisfaction of sinking. We had been hit by 6 suicide planes and 4 bombs, yet our commander, Captain Beckton, famously said he would never abandon ship as long as a single gun could fire. That statement became the psychological anchor for the entire crew, a promise that we would either sail home together or go down fighting to the last man. We were the Laffey, and we were making the Japanese Empire pay for every inch of steel they tried to take from us. As the last of the 22 attackers was either shot down or driven off, a strange and heavy silence finally settled over the blackened and broken USS Laffey. The fascination of the aftermath was the sight of the ship. She was a twisted, smoking ruin that looked more like a scrapyard than a functioning and lethal warship. The psychological weight of the 80-minute battle was etched into the faces of the survivors, who stood amongst the wreckage in a state of silent and profound shock. The secret flaw of the Japanese plan was revealed. They had used a massive force to destroy one ship, and yet that ship was still afloat and still defiant. We were towed back to port, a journey that felt like a victory parade for a ghost that had returned from the very gates of the afterlife. The story of the Laffey is the story of what happens when a crew decides that surrender is not an option, no matter how many fires are burning. We were the ship that would not die, and our scars would become the most proud and enduring medals of honor we would ever wear. The fascination with the USS Laffey's survival deepened as we began to assess the structural wounds that should have sent any other vessel to the bottom. The psychological weight of seeing the aft section completely engulfed in flames was a sight that tested the resolve of even the most seasoned and hardened veterans. The secret flaw of our design was the exposed nature of the steering gear, which had been mangled by the very first successful suicide strike on our stern. We were a wounded predator, circling helplessly in the water while the Japanese pilots circled above like vultures waiting for the final and fatal moment of collapse. Yet the crew transformed this vulnerability into a tactical advantage, using the ship's forced rotation to bring every available gun to bear on the horizon. Every man became an essential link in a chain of survival that refused to snap, regardless of the heat or the mounting and bloody casualties. We were literally holding the ship together with our bare hands and a stubborn refusal to let the Pacific Ocean claim our proud hull. The psychological weight of the smoke was so dense that the gunners often had to fire by sound and instinct, rather than by a clear visual sight. The fascination of the combat was the proximity of the enemy. Planes were flying so low that the muzzle blasts from our guns were scorching their wings. The secret flaw of the kamikaze tactic was the narrow window of opportunity they had to strike the vital organs of the ship before being shredded. We watched as one Val bomber clipped the superstructure, spraying aviation fuel across the deck and turning the midships area into a secondary and terrifying wall of fire. Amidst this chaos, the damage control parties worked with a suicidal bravery of their own, crawling through the heat to patch the gaping and jagged holes. There was no time for fear, only the mechanical repetition of loading, aiming, and firing until the barrels of the 20mm cannons began to glow a dull red. We were a ship of fire and iron, a manifestation of the American spirit that had been forged in the furnaces of the Great Depression. I remember the secret flaw of our communication system, which was severed early in the fight, leaving each gun mount to fight its own private and lonely war. The fascination of this decentralization was the initiative shown by young sailors who had never led men before, but were now commanding entire batteries. The psychological weight of being cut off from the bridge meant you had to trust that the man next to you was still alive and still fighting. We could hear the muffled explosions from the other side of the ship, but the smoke made it impossible to know if the Laffey was still a single entity. Yet the guns never stopped their rhythmic thumping, a sound that served as a heartbeat for the men trapped below the decks in the flooded compartments. We were a collection of individuals who had been fused into a single weapon of defiance, each mount a fortress that refused to fall silent. The ship was dying, but she was taking the enemy with her, one plane at a time, in a display of raw and unadulterated power. The fascination with Captain Becton's leadership became the anchor for our sanity as he stood on the open bridge, exposed to the strafing fire of the Zeros. The psychological weight of his decision to stay at Picket Station 1 was felt by every man who looked up and saw him still standing there. The secret flaw of our situation was that we were technically outmatched, but the captain's calm demeanor suggested that the math of the battle simply did not apply to us. He watched as a bomb exploded near the bridge, showering him with glass and splinters, yet he never lowered his binoculars or lost his cold and focused grip. His presence was a silent command that echoed through the ship. If the old man isn't quitting, then none of us are going to quit today. This shared resolve created a psychological shield that was stronger than any armor plate, a collective belief that the Laffey was truly and utterly invincible. We weren't just fighting for the war anymore. We were fighting for the man next to us and the man who led us into the fire. The psychological weight of the near misses was often worse than the direct hits, as the towering geysers of water threatened to swamp the low-slung and battered destroyer. The fascination of the naval battle was the sheer volume of metal in the air, a lethal cloud of shrapnel that made the deck a death trap. The secret flaw of the Japanese pilots was their obsession with hitting the bridge, which allowed our aft gunners to remain operational even as the stern burned. We watched one Oscar fighter bomber attempt to skip a bomb into our hull, only for it to explode in the wake of our forced and tight circle. The spray of the sea mixed with the blood on the deck, creating a slick and dangerous surface that made every movement a struggle for life. Yet, the ammunition passers kept running, their lungs burning from the acrid smoke and the salt air, driven by a desperate and powerful adrenaline. We were the prey that had grown teeth, a small ship that was proving to be a much bigger problem than the enemy had ever anticipated. I often think about the secret flaw of our anti-aircraft shells, which sometimes failed to explode, forcing our gunners to rely on direct hits to stop the planes. The fascination of the stop-action moments was seeing a kamikaze just feet away, the pilot's face visible as he tried to guide his aircraft into our funnel. The psychological weight of that direct eye contact was a haunting experience that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their long and quiet lives. We were fighting a human-guided missile, a technology of flesh and bone that was designed to bypass our mechanical defenses and strike at our hearts. Our only response was to keep pumping lead into the sky, creating a wall of lead so thick that it seemed to slow down time itself. The Laffey was a sieve of holes, her hull riddled with thousands of shrapnel punctures, yet her engines continued to hum with a defiant and steady rhythm. We were a testament to the quality of the steel and the quality of the men who had been trained to defend it. The fascination with the ship's medic, the Doc, was another part of the legend, as he moved through the carnage with a bag of morphine and bandages. The psychological weight of the injuries was immense, yet he never faltered, treating the wounded in the middle of the fire and the falling shells of the enemy. The secret flaw of our medical station was its exposure, but the Doc ignored the zeros to reach the men who had been mangled by the explosions. He was a symbol of the humanity that remained even in the middle of the most inhuman and mechanical slaughter the world had seen. We saw him kneeling over a young sailor while a kamikaze exploded just 50 yards away, and he didn't even flinch or look up from his work. This kind of courage was infectious, spreading from the medical teams to the gunners and down into the flooded and dark engineering spaces below. We were a ship of heroes not by choice but by the necessity of the fire that was trying to consume our very existence. The psychological weight of the ammunition running low was a terror that began to creep into the minds of the gun captains as the battle reached its peak. The fascination of the logistics was the way we began to scavenge shells from the damaged mounts to keep the operational ones firing at the swarm. The secret flaw of our supply was the reality that we had already fired more rounds in an hour than we usually fired in a month. We were running on empty, yet the intensity of the Japanese attack showed no signs of slowing down or losing its fanatical and deadly focus. Every shell became a precious commodity, a life-saving tool that had to be used with a precision that was almost impossible in the chaos. We started to conserve our fire, waiting until the planes were so close we could see the rivets on their wings before pulling the triggers. This proximity added to the fascination and the horror of the fight, as the explosions were now happening right on our very doorstep. I remember the secret flaw of our firefighting equipment, which was destroyed in several sections of the ship, forcing us to use buckets of seawater to fight the gasoline. The fascination of the human chain was the way cooks, stewards, and clerks joined the line to keep the flames away from the primary depth charges. The psychological weight of knowing we were sitting on a powder keg was a constant pressure that made every flame seem like a final and ultimate threat. We were fighting two wars, one against the planes in the sky and one against the fire that was eating the ship from the inside. The heat was so intense that it warped the deck plates, making them curl like paper under the feet of the men who refused to move. We were a ship in agony, a living creature of steel that was being tortured by the fire, yet the spirit of the crew remained cool. The Laffey was a name that would soon be whispered with awe throughout the entire fleet as the news of our stand began to spread. As the second hour of the battle approached, The fascination with our survival turned into a kind of religious awe among the men who were still standing. The psychological weight of the 77 casualties we had already taken was heavy, but the ship remained afloat, and the guns remained active and loud. The secret flaw of the enemy's fanatical resolve was that it had met an even stronger resolve in the hearts of the American sailors on the picket line. We were the ship that would not die, and the title was being earned with every drop of blood and every scorched inch of our gray paint. The horizon was still full of smoke, and the sound of engines still filled the air, but we knew that we had already passed the point of no return. We were going to survive, not because it was likely, but because we had collectively decided that sinking was simply not on the day's agenda. The Laffey was a legend in the making, and we were the authors who were writing it in the fire of Okinawa. The fascination with the USS Laffey's survival reached a fever pitch, as the radar picket station became a whirlpool of falling steel and burning aircraft wings. The psychological weight of the sheer numbers was staggering, as a fresh wave of 12 Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon, determined to finish what the others had started. The secret flaw of our primary 5-inch battery was that the electrical aiming systems were now completely dead, forced into a slow and manual operation by hand. Our gunners were literally cranking the massive turrets by sheer muscle power, sweating through their uniforms as they tried to track the high-speed suicide dives. The fascination of the struggle shifted to the engineering rooms, where men worked in darkness to keep the steam pressure high enough to maintain the ship's frantic speed. We were a machine being pushed to the point of structural failure, yet the metal held together against the mounting and violent pressure of the sea. Every shudder of the hull felt like a groan of defiance from the ship itself, a silent promise that she would not surrender to the abyss. The psychological weight of the suicide wave was intensified by the sight of our own 20mm shells bouncing off the armored noses of the incoming Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. The fascination of the ballistics was a grim reality. We were hitting them, but they were so determined that they kept flying through the leaden hail like vengeful ghosts. The secret flaw of our defensive screen was the lack of space to maneuver, as near misses created massive geysers that temporarily blinded our remaining and operational gun directors. We saw one Oscar take a direct hit to the engine, yet it used its dying momentum to glide toward our bridge, missing the mast by only a few feet. The heat of its passing was like a blast from a furnace, a reminder that death was only a fraction of a second away at any given moment. We were living in a world of blurred lines where the sky and the sea were both filled with the fire and the debris of the dying empire. The Laffey was a scorched island in a sea of madness, her gray paint now hidden under a layer of soot and the black oil of the enemy. I remember the secret flaw of our ammunition handling, as the elevators jammed and sailors began to form human chains to haul heavy shells up from the deep magazines. The fascination of the human effort was the only thing keeping the guns speaking their thunderous language of resistance against the Japanese pilots in the air. The psychological weight of carrying live explosives through a burning corridor is a memory that defines the courage of the American sailor during the Pacific War. We didn't think about the risk. We only thought about the next shell and the next plane that was trying to kill our brothers on the deck. The fascination of the coordination was remarkable, as men from the laundry and the galley worked alongside the gunners to keep the supply lines flowing. We were a community of firemen, soldiers, and sailors all fused into a single defensive organism that refused to let its heartbeat stop or falter. The ship was wounded, but her spirit was being fed by the desperate and heroic energy of a crew that knew no other way but forward. The psychological weight of the silence from the aft section was a terrifying mystery to those of us stationed forward, as the smoke blocked our view of the carnage. The fascination of the unknown was a heavy burden, as we wondered if the stern had already been blown off by the relentless and repeated kamikaze impacts. The secret flaw of our ship's layout was the lack of internal communication, forcing runners to dash across the fire-swept decks to deliver vital orders to the guns. We watched these young men sprint through the shrapnel, their lives hanging by a thread as they carried the messages that kept the ship in the fight. The fascination of their bravery was a light in the darkness, a testament to the bond that exists between men who have faced the fire together. We saw one runner go down, only for another to immediately drop his fire hose and pick up the message to finish the dangerous run. The Laffey was a vessel of sacrifice, and every inch of her deck was becoming a sacred ground for the men who were giving their all. I often think about the secret flaw of the 40mm Bofors mounts, which were firing so rapidly that the barrels began to warp and jam from the extreme heat. The fascination of the mechanical failure was met by the ingenuity of the gun crews, who used buckets of water to cool the metal down. The psychological weight of a jammed gun in the middle of a dive was a panic-inducing moment that required a calm and steady hand to clear. We watched as one gunner used a heavy wrench to beat a deformed shell into the chamber, desperate to get back into the fight before the next plane arrived. The fascination of the improvisation was the hallmark of the Laffey's crew, a collection of men who refused to be defeated by the limitations of their gear. We were fighting with everything we had, from the heavy 5-inch shells down to the sidearms of the officers who fired at the passing Zeros. It was an all-out brawl on the high seas, a primitive and violent struggle that stripped away everything but the raw instinct to stay alive. The psychological weight of the arriving Hellcats was a moment of pure cinematic beauty as they dove from the clouds to intercept the remaining Japanese suicide planes. The fascination of the air battle was the chaos of friendly and enemy aircraft weaving through our own thick and deadly anti-aircraft fire from the ship. The secret flaw of the air cover was the danger of our own gunners hitting the American pilots in the confusion of the smoke and the fire. We watched a Hellcat chase a Zero so low that it actually flew between our funnels, the roar of its engine shaking the bridge and our very souls. The fascination of the pilot's skill was a sight we would never forget, a display of aerial mastery that gave us a brief moment of hope. Yet the Kamikazes were relentless, ignoring the fighters to keep their focus on the battered and broken hull of the Laffey below them. We were the prize they wanted, and they were willing to fly through a wall of friendly and enemy fire to claim our ship. I remember the secret flaw of our radar, which had been knocked out early, leaving us to rely on our eyes and the screams of the lookouts. The fascination of the visual spotting was the intense pressure it put on the young men, standing in the exposed tubs with their binoculars. The psychological weight of being the first to see the next dive was a responsibility that carried the life or death of everyone on the ship. We heard the cry "plane port side," and the ship would heel over as the helmsman tried to bring the guns to bear in time. The fascination of the reaction time was incredible, a synchronized dance of men and machinery that happened in the span of a few heartbeats. We were a ship of 300 souls, all vibrating with the same urgency and the same desperate and powerful will to keep our home afloat. The Laffey was a sieve, leaking oil and water from 1,000 wounds, but she was still a queen of the Pacific in her own right. The psychological weight of the casualties was becoming a heavy fog that threatened to dampen our spirits as the battle reached its 80-minute mark on the clock. The fascination of the medical triage was a grim reality, as the mess decks were converted into a theater of blood and the smell of antiseptic. The secret flaw of our small medical staff was being overwhelmed by the sheer number of burn victims and those hit by the flying shrapnel. Yet the doc and his assistants never stopped, moving with a mechanical and professional grace that saved dozens of lives in the middle of the hell. The fascination of the human body's resilience was as impressive as the ship's, as men with terrible wounds refused to leave their posts until the fight was over. We saw one sailor with a shattered arm continue to pass ammunition with his good hand, his eyes fixed on the sky with a fierce and burning glare. These were the men of the Laffey, the ones who earned her the title of the ship that would not die with their very blood. I often think about the secret flaw of our fire control computers, which were destroyed by a direct bomb hit, leaving our main guns to fire by instinct. The fascination of the manual gunnery was a return to the old ways of naval warfare, where the skill of the gunner was everything in the fight. The psychological weight of knowing you were the only thing between a kamikaze and the ship's bridge was a pressure that few men could handle. Yet our gunners stayed at their sights, their hands steady on the wheels as they tracked the fast-moving and lethal shadows in the gray smoke. The fascination of the direct hits we achieved was a source of grim satisfaction as we watched the enemy planes disintegrate under the weight of our 5-inch shells. We were proving that a determined crew could overcome any technological failure, as long as they had the courage to stay and fight the fire. The Laffey was a mangled wreck, but she was a wreck that still had a bite, a wounded wolf that was still dangerous to the very end. As the third wave of attackers began to thin out, the fascination with our survival turned into a quiet and intense focus on the long journey back home. The psychological weight of the battle was still present, but the immediate threat of sinking seemed to have been averted by the grace of the sea. The secret flaw of the Japanese assault was their inability to land a killing blow on the ship's primary engineering and propulsion spaces below the water. We were still moving, still breathing, and still flying our flag from the charred and leaning remains of our main radar mast in the wind. The fascination of the moment was the realization that we had survived the impossible, a feat that would soon be told in every naval academy in the world. We were the USS Laffey, and we had just written a chapter of history in the fire and the salt of the Okinawa picket line. The dawn was coming and we were still here to see it, a ship of ghosts that refused to give up the ghost. The fascination with the USS Laffey's endurance turned into a spiritual experience for those of us still standing amidst the twisted and blackened metal. The psychological weight of the carnage on the fantail was balanced by the raw and primal scream of the engines as we kept our speed. The secret flaw of our defensive posture was our total isolation at Picket Station 1, far from the support of the heavy cruisers and their guns. We were a single small target in a vast and indifferent sea, yet we were absorbing a punishment that would have crippled a battleship. The fascination of the ship's buoyancy was a mystery to the engineers, who watched the water rising in the aft compartments with a focused and silent dread. Every time the hull groaned, we wondered if it was the sound of the final and fatal crack that would end our desperate struggle. Yet the deck beneath our feet remained steady, a platform of steel that seemed to share our collective and defiant human will to live. The psychological weight of the fire reached its peak when the gasoline from 2 crashed valves leaked into the magazine of the aft 5-inch gun mount. The fascination of the danger was absolute. We were sailing on top of a massive bomb that was being licked by the hungry and hot flames. The secret flaw of our firefighting efforts was the loss of water pressure in the hoses, forcing men to face the fire with nothing. We saw sailors using their bare hands to throw burning debris overboard, their skin blistering in the intense heat of the gasoline and the oil. The fascination of their sacrifice was a sight that defined the spirit of the Laffey, a brotherhood of fire that refused to let go. We were a ship in a state of grace, where the impossible became the standard and the miraculous was just another part of the day. Every man was a firefighter, every man was a gunner, and every man was a savior to the brother standing right beside him. I remember the secret flaw of our depth charge racks, which were damaged and threatened to drop their lethal and explosive cargo onto our own deck. The fascination of the risk was a secondary thought to the men who scrambled to secure the heavy barrels, while the Zeros strafed them. The psychological weight of knowing that a single spark could end the legend of the Laffey kept us moving through the thick and acrid smoke. We watched as one sailor, his uniform half burned away, used a heavy sledgehammer to bend a metal rail back into place to save the ship. The fascination of his focus was a testament to the training and the grit that had been pounded into us during the long Pacific months. We were a ship of 300 souls, but we were acting as one, a singular and focused mind dedicated to the survival of our home. The sea was hungry for us, and the sky was full of death, but the Laffey was a fortress of iron that would not yield. The psychological weight of the near misses was a constant drumbeat on the hull as bombs exploded close enough to lift the entire ship out of the water. The fascination of the hydrodynamics was a terrifying thing to experience, feeling the vibrations of the ocean through the very soles of our boots. The secret flaw of our maneuverability was the jammed rudder, which kept us in that predictable and wide circle that the enemy now knew. Yet Captain Becton used the timing of the circle to create a rhythm of defense that the Japanese pilot struggled to anticipate and overcome. The fascination of his tactical mind was our greatest asset, a human computer that was outperforming the damaged mechanical ones on the bridge. We were a ship that was dancing with death, a choreographed and violent ballet of smoke, fire, and the screaming of high-speed aircraft. The Laffey was a target that refused to be hit again, a slippery and defiant ghost that was haunting the very men trying to kill her. I often think about the secret flaw of the 20mm magazines, which were running dry across the entire length of the battered and bloodied destroyer. The fascination of the improvisation was the way sailors began to use captured Japanese weapons and anything else they could find to keep fighting. The psychological weight of an empty gun is a silence that rings louder than any explosion in the middle of a heated and deadly battle. We saw men throwing empty shell casings at low-flying Zeros, a gesture of defiance that showed the enemy we would never be truly conquered. The fascination of their spirit was a fire that could not be extinguished by the gasoline or the bombs that were raining down. We were the ship that would not die because we were a crew that would not quit, a collection of men who had found their limit and pushed past it. The Laffey was a mangled ruin, but she was a ruin that still had a soul, and that soul was screaming at the sky. The psychological weight of the arriving Hellcats was a moment of hope, but it also added to the complexity and the danger of our defense. The fascination of the dogfights happening just feet above our heads was a spectacle of aerial skill that few people have ever seen. The secret flaw of the situation was the crossfire, as we had to be careful not to shoot down the very pilots who were coming to save us. We watched as a Hellcat and a Zero collided in midair, a ball of fire that rained down on the water just off our port side. The fascination of the debris was a constant hazard, as pieces of wings and engines pelted our deck like a lethal and metallic rain. We were a ship in a blender, a swirling and chaotic environment where every second brought a new and different threat to our lives. Yet the Laffey remained steady in her circle, her gun still barking at the shadows that moved through the thick and gray smoke. I remember the secret flaw of our light and power, which flickered and died multiple times as the cables were shredded by the shrapnel. The fascination of working in the dark was a nightmare for the damage control parties who were trying to plug the holes in the hull. The psychological weight of being below the waterline in a dark and flooding compartment is a terror that few men can truly describe. We used flashlights held in our teeth while we hammered wood plugs into the jagged leaks, the cold seawater rising to our chests. The fascination of the struggle was the quiet communication between the men, the calm and steady voices that kept the panic at a distance. We were the unsung heroes of the Laffey, the ones who kept her afloat while the gunners above took the glory and the fire. The ship was a living thing to us, and we were the doctors trying to keep her heart beating in the middle of a slaughter. The psychological weight of the casualties in the forward repair party was a blow that almost broke our ability to respond to the fires. The fascination of the replacement system was the way clerks and cooks stepped into the roles of engineers and firefighters without a second thought. The secret flaw of our training was that we were all specialists, but the fire had made us all generalists in the art of survival. We saw a young steward who had never held a fire hose lead a charge into a burning compartment to rescue a trapped sailor. The fascination of his courage was a reflection of the entire crew, a collective heroism that was being born in the fire of Okinawa. We were the Laffey, and we were proving that the sum of our parts was much greater than the steel we were made of. The ship was a sieve of holes, but she was being held together by the blood and the will of the men who called her home. I often think about the secret flaw of the captain's binoculars, which were shattered by a stray bullet as he watched the horizon for the next wave. The fascination of the moment was that he didn't even flinch, simply picking up another pair and continuing his steady and focused watch of the sea. The psychological weight of his calm was the only thing that kept the bridge crew from falling into a state of total and utter panic. We looked at him and we saw a man who had already accepted his fate, and that acceptance gave him a power that was absolute. The fascination of his leadership was not in his words but in his presence, a pillar of stone in a world that was melting. We were a ship of 300, but we were all following the steady hand of one man who refused to blink at death. The Laffey was a legend, and the captain was the architect who was building it in the smoke and the fire of the battle. As the 80-minute mark passed, the fascination with our survival was no longer a question of luck, but a proven fact of our resilience. The psychological weight of the battle was still heavy, but the intensity of the Japanese attack was finally starting to fade and thin. The secret flaw of the Kamikaze mission was that they had run out of planes before they could run out of the Laffey's will. We were still there, still moving, and still firing the few guns that were not twisted into useless and burnt shapes of metal. The fascination of the moment was the sight of the horizon clearing, the smoke beginning to drift away to reveal the vast and empty sea. We were the ship that would not die, and we had just survived the most concentrated aerial assault in the history of naval warfare. The dawn was coming, and the Laffey was still a queen of the Pacific, a ship of ghosts that had refused to surrender. The fascination with the USS Laffey's survival entered its most harrowing phase as the remaining Japanese pilots realized their prey was still defiant. The psychological weight of the silence from our own destroyed gun mounts was a haunting contrast to the roar of the diving engines above us. The secret flaw of our endurance was the absolute depletion of our medical supplies, leaving the wounded to suffer with nothing but courage. We watched as the final two kamikazes coordinated a pincer attack, aiming for the bridge from both the port and starboard sides simultaneously. The fascination of the moment was the total focus of our remaining 20mm gunners, who stood their ground even as the planes loomed large. The psychological weight of the impact seemed inevitable, yet the gunners never wavered, tracking the targets with a cold and mechanical precision that defied fear. Every man on the deck held his breath as the world narrowed down to a few yards of screaming metal and the smell of death. The secret flaw of the final suicide dive was the pilot's slight overcorrection, which caused his wing to clip our remaining lifeboats instead of the bridge. The fascination of the near miss was a physical shockwave that knocked the bridge crew to their knees but left the command structure intact. The psychological weight of being spared for the 10th time that morning was enough to make even the most cynical sailor believe in miracles. We saw the plane tumble into the sea, exploding in a massive fireball that scorched the side of the ship, but failed to penetrate. The fascination of our luck was becoming a legend in real time, whispered between the men who were still hauling ammunition through the blood. We were a ship that had been marked for destruction by an entire empire, yet we were still refusing to acknowledge the end. The Laffey was a scorched and twisted monument to survival, her hull vibrating with the energy of a crew that had found its soul. I remember the secret flaw of our visibility as the fires from the aft deck began to wrap around the superstructure in a black embrace. The fascination of the navigation was a nightmare, as Captain Beckton had to steer the ship by the feel of the wind and the salt. The psychological weight of being blind in a minefield of suicide pilots was a pressure that few men could handle without breaking. Yet the voices of the lookouts remained steady, calling out the bearing of every new speck on the horizon with a chilling and calm clarity. The fascination of the teamwork was our only radar, a human network of eyes and ears that replaced the broken vacuum tubes of the ship. We were a collective organism of 300 men, all wired into the same desperate and powerful rhythm of the fight for life. The ship was a mangled ruin, but she was a ruin that was still moving at 25 knots through the churning and bloody sea. The psychological weight of the ammunition magazines being flooded was a final and desperate gamble to save the ship from a total and catastrophic explosion. The fascination of the decision was the risk of losing our buoyancy entirely, turning the Laffey into a heavy and slow-moving target for the enemy. The secret flaw of the flooding was the loss of stability, causing the ship to take on a terrifying list to the port side. We felt the deck tilt beneath our feet, a sensation that usually signals the beginning of the end for any destroyer in a fight. Yet, the engineers managed to balance the weight by counter-flooding, a delicate and dangerous dance with the ocean that required nerves of pure steel. The fascination of their technical skill in the middle of a burning inferno was as impressive as any feat of the gunners on deck. We were a ship of engineers, firefighters, and warriors, all working together to keep the grand old lady of the picket line afloat. I often think about the secret flaw of the sky above us, which was so thick with anti-aircraft smoke that it blocked out the morning sun. The fascination of the twilight atmosphere was eerie, as if we had been transported to another world where the only light came from fire. The psychological weight of the endless morning was a fatigue that seeped into our bones, making our movements slow and our reactions heavy and dull. We saw sailors leaning against the bulkheads for just a second of rest, only to be jolted back to life by the scream of another zero. The fascination of the adrenaline was our only fuel, a chemical fire that kept our hearts beating when our bodies wanted to collapse. We were a crew of walking ghosts, covered in the soot and the grease of a battle that had stripped away our youth. The Laffey was our only world, and we were determined to defend every scorched inch of her until the very last shell was fired. The psychological weight of the Hellcat's departure was a moment of sharp anxiety, as they were forced to return to their carriers for more fuel. The fascination of being alone again on the picket line was a test of our resolve that we hadn't expected to face so late. The secret flaw of our isolation was the fear that a lone, undetected attacker could slip through the haze and deliver the final killing blow. We scanned the empty sky with a desperate intensity, our eyes burning from the salt and the acrid smoke of the gasoline fires. The fascination of the silence was a heavy thing, a quiet that felt like it was waiting for something terrible to happen to the ship. Yet, the guns remained manned, the barrels pointed toward the horizon with a defiance that was as sharp as it had been at dawn. We were the ship that would not die, and we were prepared to prove it for a second time if the enemy returned. I remember the secret flaw of the captain's voice, which had grown hoarse from shouting orders over the roar of the fires and the guns. The fascination of his presence was still the only thing holding the bridge crew together in the middle of the smoking and broken metal. The psychological weight of his responsibility was visible in the lines of his face, yet his eyes remained as cold and clear as the ocean. We saw him look at the charred remains of the fantail and then back at the horizon, his mind already calculating the next move. The fascination of his leadership was its quietness, a calm that acted as a vacuum, sucking the panic out of the air before it could spread. We were a ship that was following a man into the dark, and we trusted him more than we trusted the steel we were standing on. The Laffey was his ship, and he was the soul that was keeping her from sinking into the vast and indifferent blue of the Pacific. The fascination with the ship's damage control parties reached a climax as they successfully isolated the fires from the primary and vital ammunition hoist. The psychological weight of their success was a wave of relief that surged through the ship, giving us a second wind for the long journey. The secret flaw of the firefighting was the lack of fresh water, forcing the men to use anything they could find to cool the metal. We saw sailors using fruit juices from the galley, and even urine to cool down the overheated barrels of the 40mm cannons. The fascination of the desperation was a testament to the creativity of the American sailor when faced with a certain and violent death. We were a ship of improvisers, turning the wreckage of our home into the tools of our survival in the middle of the sea. The Laffey was a mangled mess, but she was a mess that was still fighting, a wounded warrior that refused to lay down and die. I often think about the secret flaw of the Japanese pilots, who focused so much on the Laffey that they failed to hit the other ships nearby. The fascination of our role as a magnet for death was a heavy psychological burden that we carried with a grim and silent pride. We had taken the hit so that others wouldn't have to, absorbing the fury of an entire empire on our small and battered hull. The psychological weight of that sacrifice was felt by every man who looked at the empty spaces where his friends had stood just an hour ago. The fascination of the brotherhood was the way we didn't talk about it, simply nodded to each other and kept moving through the debris. We were the survivors of Picket Station 1, and we were bound together by a bond of blood and fire that would never be broken. The Laffey was our shared home, and we had defended it with everything we were and everything we ever hoped to be. As the final smoke of the 80-minute battle began to drift away, the fascination of the sight of the ship was truly and utterly overwhelming. The psychological weight of the damage was evident in every twisted rail and every gaping hole in the hull that was leaking black oil. The secret flaw of the enemy's attack was their failure to realize that a ship is more than just steel. It is the spirit of the men inside. We were still afloat, still under power, and still flying our flag from the remains of the mast that had been bent by the fire. The fascination of the moment was the sudden realization that we had won, that we had survived the impossible, and were still here to tell. We were the USS Laffey, and we were the ship that would not die, a legend of the Pacific that was just beginning to grow. The horizon was empty now, and the sun was finally breaking through the clouds to shine on our scorched and glorious deck. The fascination with the aftermath of the battle was a somber and reverent silence that felt heavier than the roar of the guns. The psychological weight of the toll was finally visible. 32 of our brothers were gone, and over 70 were wounded in the twisted ruins. The secret flaw of the Japanese assault was the assumption that metal alone wins wars, ignoring the unbreakable spirit of the American sailor. We began the slow, agonizing process of clearing the decks, moving the charred remnants of enemy aircraft that had become part of our own structure. The fascination of the ship's profile was ghostly, a blackened skeleton of a destroyer that looked like it had been raised from the bottom of the sea. We were a floating cemetery and a fortress at once, limping toward the safety of the repair ships with a jagged, defiant pride. Every man who could still walk was working, his eyes hollow but his hands steady as we tended to the ship. The Laffey was a survivor, and we were the guardians of a miracle that defied every calculation of naval warfare. The psychological weight of the journey to the rear area was intensified by the sight of other crews lining the rails in silent salute. The fascination of our entrance into the harbor was a moment of profound emotion, as hardened sailors wept at the sight of our mangled hull. The secret flaw of our condition was that the ship was held together by little more than hope and a few remaining structural beams of steel. We saw the faces of the repair crews change from professional focus to utter disbelief as they counted the entry and exit points of the bombs. The fascination of the Laffey began to spread like wildfire through the fleet, a story of a small destroyer that had outlasted an entire empire's fury. We were the living proof that no amount of fire could extinguish the will of a crew that refused to give up their home. The ship was more than a vessel. She was a testament to the fact that courage is the ultimate armor in the face of death. Every scar on her deck told a story of a man who stood his ground when the sky fell. I remember the secret flaw of the decommissioning process, where they tried to tell us the ship was too damaged to ever fight again in the war. The fascination of our collective protest was a reflection of the bond we had formed with the steel during those 80 minutes of hell. The psychological weight of leaving her was almost as hard as the battle itself, as she had become a part of our very identity as men. They sent her back to the States, where she became a symbol of the nation's industrial strength and the resilience of its fighting sons. The fascination of the public with the ship that would not die turned us into reluctant heroes, though we only felt like survivors. We knew that the real heroes were the ones we left in the waters off Okinawa, the ones who never got to hear the cheers. The Laffey was their monument, a scorched and battered queen of the Pacific that carried their memory in every rivet and plate. We were the voices for the silent, the ones who had to tell the world what it felt like to stand in the fire. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's immortality was proven when she was eventually repaired and returned to service for the Korean War. The psychological weight of seeing her back in the water, pristine and powerful once more, was a moment of closure for many of us. We realized then that the Laffey truly possessed a soul that was independent of the damage she had suffered in the Great War. The fascination of her longevity was a reminder that some things are meant to endure, to serve as a beacon for future generations of sailors. She eventually found her final resting place as a museum ship in South Carolina, where the fascination of her story continues to draw thousands. People walk her decks today, touching the metal and trying to imagine the heat and the noise of that terrible morning in 1945. The psychological weight of the history is palpable in the air, a thick and silent energy that speaks of a time when the world was on fire. She stands as a silent sentinel, a reminder that the price of freedom is often paid in the most concentrated and violent of hours. The secret flaw of history is that it often focuses on the machines, but the Laffey is a story about the men who made the machine invincible. The fascination of the individual acts of heroism, the runners, the gunners, the engineers, is what gives the ship its enduring and legendary status. The psychological weight of their collective courage is the true engine that drove the destroyer through the storm of kamikazes and fire. We were just ordinary men from small towns, yet we found a greatness within ourselves when the alternative was a cold and watery grave. The fascination of that transformation is the most powerful lesson of the war, a reminder of the untapped strength that lies within the human spirit. The Laffey was our crucible, the place where we were tested and found to be made of something stronger than the steel of our enemies. We are old now, our numbers thinning like the smoke of the battle, but the memory of the ship remains as sharp as a bayonet. The gray ghost of Okinawa is still sailing in our dreams, her flag flying high and her guns still barking at the dark. I often think about the secret flaw of the peace we have enjoyed since those days, and how easily the world forgets the cost of its safety. The fascination of the Laffey story is a necessary anchor for a society that often drifts away from the reality of its own hard-won survival. The psychological weight of being a witness to such carnage is a responsibility that we carry with a quiet and somber dignity for the fallen. We want the world to remember not just the victory, but the sheer agonizing effort it took to stay afloat in the middle of a global madness. The fascination of the ship's survival is a warning and a promise that terror can be defeated, but only by those willing to stand their ground. We were the ship that would not die, and our story is a gift to those who face their own storms and their own fires. The Laffey belongs to history now, but her spirit is a living flame that continues to inspire the hearts of all who hear her name. We were the lucky ones, the ones who got to see the sun rise on a world that was finally at peace again. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean is its ability to remain calm after the most violent and bloody of human conflicts. The psychological weight of looking at the blue water and knowing what lies beneath is a part of the sailor's burden that never truly leaves. We know that the Pacific is a graveyard of legends, and the Laffey is one of the few that crawled back out of the deep. The fascination of her return is a mystery of faith and engineering, a combination that made the impossible a reality on the picket line. We are proud of our ship, not because she was the biggest or the fastest, but because she was the toughest and the most loyal. She brought us home when the world expected us to vanish, and for that, we owe her a debt that can never be fully paid. The story of the Laffey is a story of love. The love of a crew for their ship and the love of a ship for her crew. It is a bond that transcends the metal and the oil, a connection that is as eternal as the salt of the sea. The psychological weight of the final reunion was a moment of deep reflection as we stood on the deck of our old home one last time. The fascination of the gray paint and the smell of the sea brought it all back. The smoke, the screams, and the thumping of the guns in the air. The secret flaw of our age was that we could no longer run the decks, but in our minds we were still those 19-year-old boys in the fire. We looked at each other, and we didn't see the wrinkles or the white hair. We saw the warriors who had saved a queen from the abyss. The fascination of our shared history was the only language we needed, a silent understanding that was deeper than any words could ever hope to be. We were the survivors of Picket Station 1, the men who had looked death in the eye and refused to blink or turn away. The Laffey was still there, a solid and comforting presence under our feet, a witness to the fact that we had once been giants. Our watch was almost over, but the ship would remain, a permanent record of our courage and our shared and bloody youth. The fascination with the secret flaw of the final chapter is that there is no ending, only a continuation of the legend in the hearts of others. The psychological weight of the story is now yours to carry, a reminder of what the human spirit can achieve when it is pushed to the limit. We hope you look at the USS Laffey and see more than just a museum. We hope you see the fire, the smoke, and the will. The fascination of the ship that would not die is a beacon of hope for anyone facing a battle that seems too big to win alone. We were just a small destroyer, but we changed the course of a morning and the hearts of an entire fleet with our stand. The psychological weight of the history is a gift of perspective, a chance to see the value of a single defiant act in a world of chaos. The Laffey is at peace now, her engines silent and her guns cold, but the echo of her thunder will never truly fade away. She is the queen of the picket line, the ship that lived to tell the tale of the divine wind. If the incredible story of the USS Laffey and her crew's defiant stand against 22 attackers has moved you, please consider subscribing for more. We are committed to honoring the legends of the sea and the men who turned steel into history through their raw and unyielding courage. The fascination with the ship that would not die is a tribute to the power of the human spirit when it is forged in the fire. Comment below, what do you think was the most miraculous part of the Laffey's survival, and could a modern ship endure the same today? Share this story of the gray ghost of Okinawa to ensure that the sacrifice and the grit of her crew are never forgotten by time. Your support helps us keep the light on for these stories, bringing them out of the smoke and back into the sun where they belong. Thank you for standing with us on the deck of the Laffey, and for remembering the heroes of Picket Station 1. The dawn is here, the sea is calm, and the legend of the USS Laffey will sail on forever in our hearts.